So hi everyone, welcome back to our
Hello.
podcast. Hello. So not only do I have 𝗔হি with me today, we also have our first guest speaker. So we have Derek with us today. Derek Sheridan is an anthropologist. He is Associate Research Fellow at the Institute of Ethnology at Academia Sinica in Taiwan. And we invited Derek with us today to talk a bit more about his research on China-Africa. So first things first, Derek, we are so happy to have you with us. Can you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about your experiences and how you came to study the Chinese in East Africa?
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, I mean, it's a long story, as these things usually tend to be. I think there are two kinds of ways that people get involved in research that involves Africa and China or Asia. Either they have sort of come to it out of experience or expertise in Asia or China, or like a Chinese studies or Asian studies background, or they come to it out of a background in Africa or African studies. And from there, they then get into the topic. For me, it was more, actually sort of started in China studies, actually. In college, I was taking Chinese as a second language, and that kind of led into a topic that I might want to study in graduate school. And even already in undergrad, I had sort of an idea that, a possible topic would be this China-Africa story, because this is around 2006. So around 2006, there was a lot of controversy about China's relationship to Sudan, for example, if you remember. And this was also the year of the 𝗏, the first China-Africa Forum on China-Africa cooperation. And so the idea kind of passed through my mind, but when I asked my advisors at the time, they said, no, that's a bad idea. You have no background or experience in Africa. You'll never get into a grad school program with that. And so I just kind of dropped it. And I lived in Taiwan for a couple of years, and then I became interested in Taiwan. And when I did go to grad school, I had a Taiwan project in mind. But the project I had in mind was the history of Taiwan's relationship with, as the way I framed it at the time, U.S. empire or Pax Americana. I was really interested in the traces of U.S. aid in Taiwan, or U.S. presence. And so I originally had a project wanting to sort of look historically at that presence. And this is very interesting because at the time, no one was really looking at this Cold War era. Now it's everyone's doing it.
Yes.
I even had an advisor say, no one cares about Taiwan in the 1950s, but now, that's like a big topic now, at least in history. But I was sort of approaching it from an interest in anthropology, because I wanted to work with Catherine Lutz, who did work on U.S. empire as an anthropologist. And what happened is, when I remember I was presenting once in a class, my first year of grad school. I was doing a slideshow about the history of U.S. aid in Taiwan, and I was talking about the circulation of symbols, particularly the 𝗏𝘁𝘁𝗶𝗰, with the two hands clasping. And I was going into a whole kind of analysis of what that means and how it's afterlives. And one of my classmates was my colleague, 𝗏𝘁𝘁𝗶𝗰 He's from Tanzania. He's currently an assistant professor at NYU Shanghai. And he said, Derek, this presentation reminds me so much of, the experience of China in Tanzania. And I'm like, oh, really? Tell me more. And he said, of course, there was a long history in Tanzania of China and Tanzania and Zambia building the railway, from the late 60s to the mid 70s, the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, 𝗧. And also, not just that, but even in the 1980s when he was growing up in northern Tanzania, he remembers sort of China very present. He said, everyone was watching kung fu movies. And that actually the Chinese government, the Foreign Translation Office, was actually publishing in Kiswahili, the language that they speak in Tanzania, manuals for doing wushu, and also various descriptions of China's rocket program, etc. And I thought, oh, this is a very interesting kind of parallel but somewhat different kind of history. And what really kind of pushed me into, well, one more thing actually. He said that now things are much more complicated because there's been a lot more Chinese coming into Tanzania, and people don't really know why they're there. There's a lot of controversy. People are complaining that whereas the Indians sort of had boundaries, like they would only do some businesses, the Chinese do everything. They even sell peanuts on the street. And so it was giving me this sort of this sense that, oh, well, there's a really interesting story in this place I know very little about. And what kind of pushed me into doing the project was in my grad school program, there was a class on Africa studies that I had to take because there was no other option at the time. And I needed to prepare a paper. And so I thought, oh, I'll look at what has been done ethnographically about Africa-China relations. And once I began to look into it, and this is around 2012, there was very little published. And when I say little published, there was actually a lot published about China-Africa, but most of it was, as one colleague described it during a conference, the view from like 30,000 feet. It was just basically someone doing desktop research, looking at various news reports and then writing something. And in sort of like China, opportunity or threat, and you have like 300 different papers that are just the exact same kind of framework. But there was very little done of people doing what I was being trained to do, which is long-term ethnographic fieldwork, where you go to a place and you live there for 12 months or longer, and you really immerse yourself. And through that experience of being there, you then, gain an insight that supposedly other types of researchers can't get. And so the fact that at that time there was very little published from that perspective, a little light went off in my head thinking, oh, this is an opportunity. It'd be really fun if I did that. I have half the language background. I'll go to an English-speaking country. Little did I know at the time that I would end up going to Tanzania, where people speak Kiswahili much more than they speak English. And my advisors were completely supportive of it. They thought, oh, this is a great idea. And plus, there's more of a future in China-Africa studies than Taiwan studies. And so there was a bit of like, they were giving me kind of a careerist kind of advice, saying, oh, this is a hot topic. But from the beginning, I was also a little bit wary of how many times people said hot topic. And so from the beginning, I was very cautious about becoming a 100% China-Africa scholar, because I felt that this was a moment more than a thing. When I say about a moment, it's sort of like a moment in time when a certain assemblage of forces sort of come together to produce something that only makes sense within that context. And so a good example of what I'm thinking here is like the word Greater China. I remember that, 大中华. Like in the early 90s, everyone was talking about Greater China. And this was a concept which everyone was on the tips of everyone's tongues, especially talking about the Asia Pacific. That was another one of these sort of like 90s terms. And Alan Shun, one of my colleagues, formerly here at the Institute, he wrote an article saying, whatever happened to global China? Because whatever happened to Greater China? Like it disappeared and it was replaced by global China. And he argues that what changed was that, the configuration, or at least as I understand his argument, the configuration of global capital had changed, right? And so what seemed to be the imagination of the world in the 1993 was very different from how it was in 2013 when it was all China, Africa. And at that time, Belt and Road was just sort of coming into official discourse. I mean, that concept of maritime Silk Road was already in circulation before that, but of course it became Xi Jinping's policy, and then it's been all BRI, as I call it, for the next 10 years. And now we're in the so-called new Cold War. So like, there's always a new geographical term to make up every 10 years. So I was always a little bit afraid to say that I'm an Africa-China person. But at the same time, I felt it was a fascinating topic precisely because there was so much people were saying about it, but people knew very little about it. And there seemed to be such a disconnect between what you could see on the ground and the kinds of stories people would tell about it, not just in media, whether it's the so-called Western media, whatever that means, Anglophone media, or even in media in African countries, or Chinese media, or media here in Taiwan, but also what people on the street themselves would tell you. And so I was really fascinated from the beginning by just how the idea of Africa China seemed to be greater than the sum of its parts. And so that was kind of the way I kind of entered into the research, was sort of understanding, why do people put so much investment and meaning into this thing? Because when I went to Tanzania, I went to Uganda first, and then I went to Tanzania. And before I got there, in my mind, I had this image of the neo-colonial image. Whether I agreed with the neo-colonial framing or not, I kind of was thinking it through the lens that I had looked at, say, US and Taiwan. Sort of a huge outside economic and political force comes in, and you can see those traces on the ground. But my first few weeks in Uganda, I thought, where are the Chinese? I don't see anyone. All I see are Ugandans, people from other African countries, and a lot of Indians, many of them from Uganda. Same thing Tanzania. Tanzania, I saw many more Chinese, but just counting doesn't really tell a lot. But it did give me this impression that, well, this wholesale seller selling shoes, who's from, Zhejiang, from Fujian, and they're doing this sort of business, which is very similar to the kinds of businesses that Indian wholesalers had done before, that many African wholesalers are doing. This doesn't look like colonialism. This looks like something else. But then again, you also have the construction companies there as well. And so I was just fascinated by just all the different sort of levels and how people then interpret those kinds of things and put them into different kinds of frameworks. And so that was sort of how I then approached my longer fieldwork, which I did in between 2014 and 2016, when I lived in Tanzania for about 16 months. I lived in a Chinese-owned hotel, so I was there with a lot of guests who were coming and going, and so people who were sort of exploring the market themselves. And so I kind of was at the entry point, so to speak. I mean, you learn a lot by living in a hotel because you're kind of at an interesting interface, but also just spending a lot of time hanging out, as what we call, ethnography or fieldwork. A lot of it's, as what one friend called it, deep hanging out, is you basically go somewhere and you just sort of see what happened, and you kind of follow what people want you to do. And so I would go to, there's this wholesale market in Dar es Salaam called 𝗂𝗄𝗃𝗃. It's the district where a lot of import trade happens, and then they resell to traders both from Tanzania but also from neighboring African countries as well. And there are a lot of Chinese wholesalers there. They're not everywhere, but they're very important in the marketplace. And almost all the goods in 𝗂𝗃𝗃, if they don't come from a Chinese shop in 𝗂𝗃𝗃, then they come from Tanzanian traders who are going to Dubai and buying from Chinese there, or they're going to Guangzhou or Yiwu and buying from Chinese there. And so it's very much connected to that trans-oceanic trade. And I would just go there and basically hang out. I would basically sit on the corner of these shops. People were very busy, so I didn't really try to push an interview. I just kind of just talked and chatted. Very difficult to speak to a lot of Chinese business people because a lot of suspicion, not so much because they thought I was an American spy, although that does come up, but more that they thought maybe I'm working for this other Chinese person, or I'm somehow involved in business and I'm trying to do competition with them. So there was a lot of that kind of tension. So I only was sort of developed good relationships with like a few people, and then they kind of became my anchors, in which I would sort of spend time there. But then I would spend a lot of time talking to Tanzanian traders, a lot of street traders who sort of buy and sell day to day. And oftentimes they would directly approach me because I sort of stood out in the crowd, and they would talk to me, and they would interview me really about what life was like in the United States, what I was doing there. They would sometimes joke with me about how China was catching up to the U.S. and was going to, and it was just, a lot of it was just doing that. But I would also go off on these little, I don't know to say side quests. if you think of fieldwork as like an RPG, I would go on these side quests where I might get invited to go visit a factory, and I would go there, or I would find out, oh, there's a Chinese restaurant here. This is new. and I would sort of go on a long trip to try to talk to someone, but then find out that it was closed, and then it would take 2 hours to get back because the traffic in Dar is really, really bad. And so it was a lot of somewhat disorganized. I mean, I think my one regret is if I could do it again, I would have a much more clearer plan of what to do. But all my advisors at the time were saying, no, the way you do field work, you just go there and you just kind of, you just, like Wu Wei, just don't do anything. Just let it happen to you. And so that was sort of how I did that period of research.
Did you also go to join like a kung fu class or learn wushu with the local people?
Well, that's interesting. I've noticed, I mean, there are a number of people who do Africa-China research who their second projects often deal with martial arts. There are like 2 or 3. There was a talk last night by 𝗂𝘂𝘵 also about martial arts in Zambia. Someone else who did research on martial arts, 𝗬 in China, said that, well, it's much more comfortable to do research with martial artists because it's less kind of that tension with businesses and politics. It's more of like a fun topic. I mean, for me, how did I get involved with martial arts research? It wasn't. I didn't have a background in martial arts. I mean, I did Taekwondo for a few years when I was like 9 or 13, I think, but that wasn't really like a lifelong interest for me. But what got me into martial arts in Tanzania, well, there were two entry points. One is through a mutual friend, also a researcher. I met a wushu instructor who was working for the 𝗂𝘂𝘁𝗵𝗋 in Tanzania, and so he was teaching martial arts courses in Dar es Salaam, and very nice, friendly guy. And so I met him a couple times. But what happened was the same person who had originally introduced me to Tanzania, this is my colleague Yunus, he was at that time living in a town called Bagamoyo, which is about 2 hours north, well, not really north, but northwest of Dar es Salaam. And historically, this is important because Dar es Salaam is the economic capital, but Bagamoyo historically was a major trade port connecting the mainland of Africa with Zanzibar, the islands of Zanzibar, just across, not too far by boat. And during the 19th century, it was briefly the capital for the German colonists who were going there because that's where the Zanzibar Sultanate had their port when they were doing the caravan trade there. But now it's sort of a tourist, well, not entirely a tourist town, but it's a town that people will go to from Dar es Salaam for beaches. So there's beach resorts there, and also the old German Boma is there, and also they have their own stone town, much smaller than the one in Zanzibar, but a lot of old buildings that were built in the late 19th century, a graveyard. So it's an historical town, but it's also a fishing port. Most of the business there is fishing and also trade, because goods from Zanzibar are actually cheaper than some goods in mainland Tanzania. So oil, for example. And so a lot of people are involved in that. But anyway, my colleague Yunus was based in Bagamoyo, and he was writing his dissertation based on his research, which was about some other topic. And he discovered that there were his Tanzanian neighbors were doing karate, or something they called combat karate. And he began to practice with them as a sort of a, after writing a dissertation for a couple hours, he would go and practice. And he helped set them up in a dojo, in a space where they could have a permanent space for practicing. But they needed money to pave the ground. And so Yunus reached out to me saying, "Oh, Derek, can you donate?" I was like, "Okay, sure." And also, "Hey, Derek, maybe you're interested in this. They're doing martial arts. They say that their teachers were originally trained by Chinese military instructors." And so immediately, like a bell went off in my head, like, "Oh, this is interesting." And so, I started to visit just casually. I would do some classes, and the wushu instructor who I had mentioned already, he was very interested in understanding the martial arts landscape in Tanzania, because he really wanted to promote wushu as a sport in Tanzania. He thought that this could be systematized. If it had government funding and support, then young Tanzanians would have an option to make martial arts a career, the same way it had been a career for people like him in China. He thought he sort of saw this as like a development project, and so he was very interested in sort of visiting dojos. And so when I told him, I know about this dojo in Bagamoyo, he said, I want to visit. And so I arranged a visit. He did a demonstration of wushu, and actually me and Eunice later wrote an article about the after effects of that visit, because it became a bit complicated, because then it becomes a question of, well, who is introducing what to whom? Because from the perspective of this Chinese martial artist, he thought there's a lot of enthusiasm among Tanzanians for martial arts, but they don't really understand the martial arts, because they might be getting it from movies, or they might be getting it from various sources, and so they might be mixing lots of different styles, or they don't really understand like the philosophy and thinking behind martial arts. But what happened in the course of my visits to Bagamoyo is I learned from Eunice, and then many years later, from the head of this dojo in Bagamoyo. The head of this dojo, his name is Ali Isa Hassan. He had sort of a different perspective on the martial arts. He would say that, well, the martial arts that we have that are being introduced to us now from China, from Korea, from Japan, we had those things before. Africans had these martial arts a long, long time ago, but they've forgotten. But he wasn't making like an Afrocentric kind of argument, because there are martial artists in North America in the 1960s. There were some martial artists who did make this argument that martial arts were invented. The kinds of martial arts we associate with East Asia were invented in Africa, and then they went to India, and then because of an Indian monk then went to China, and so there's this idea that the real origins come from Africa. But what Ali Hassan was saying was a little bit different. He wasn't saying that it was invented by Africans per se. He was saying that the martial arts were invented by the angels, by the Malaika, and that angels taught the jinn. I guess I should give some background that most of the people on Tanzanian coast are Muslim. Tanzania is half Christian, half Muslim, officially half. But on the coast, it's more predominantly Islam. And so, Ali Hassan was saying, well, martial arts came to Africa with the Prophet. And so when I heard this story, I thought, there's no way I can't do research on this topic. It was just so fascinating. And it's only become more fascinating since. And so around that time, I thought, well, this would be a great second project to do, was really to kind of trace the histories of the martial arts. And when I say trace the histories, there's sort of two levels of that. One is these stories about where the martial arts come from, but also doing kind of historical work, sort of trying to trace teachers, who taught who. And so at the beginning, the question was, they said they were taught by Chinese military instructors. Okay, why were Chinese military instructors teaching karate? Okay, that didn't make sense. I mean, it's possible that Chinese would teach karate. For example, Stephen Chen, who's a British, I think he's a political scientist of Chinese heritage. He worked for the British government. He was in Zambia, and he taught karate. He was actually like a black belt in karate. And he's actually written an article about his experience of being like one of the top karate teachers in Zambia, like in the 80s. And he was Chinese, but he says Zambians didn't really make a distinction, at the time. And as not just Africa, North America as well. I think one of the interesting things is that everyone talks about, say, Bruce Lee, the influence of Bruce Lee in the U.S., but the actual schools that were available to train people were karate, right? And so it sort of had that weird effect in which it was Chinese martial arts, but the institutions that could actually give people what they wanted were the Japanese and Koreans. Same thing in Tanzania as well, and that's something I discovered later, is that wushu notwithstanding the close relation between Tanzania and China, karate, especially Shotokan karate, Gujuru, and Taekwondo are actually much stronger in terms of institutions. They have a much deeper institutional basis in Tanzania. But that's something I kind of learned more later. But yeah, so what happened is I was curious, where did their martial arts come from? They call it karate combat. And they said it comes from the military. And the military has something called combat killa. So it's like combat, but it's a more intense kind. It's a kind that's actually meant for like military combat. So you can't actually teach it to civilians because it would be deadly. It would kill someone. And also it would be illegal too. They have an awkward relationship with the state. The Tanzanian state doesn't really approve of a lot of these martial arts dojos. And so a lot of these dojos, if they're not registered, they often will get kind of cracked down by the police. So during elections, for example, all dojos, all martial arts schools in the country have to close down for a month. So in 2015, for the month before the election, no one could practice. Even the Confucius Institute, they had to not train people. I don't know, maybe they were afraid that, these young men, because they're mostly men, young men training, maybe they support the opposition and they're going to go out. But there's a long history to this as well. I mean, in Zanzibar, the first president of Zanzibar, Karume, actually outlawed kickboxing in the 1960s. And so there's a long history to this. But to get back to the main story, we were curious about where did the martial arts come from. So if it was Chinese teaching the military, okay, let's go interview your teachers in Zanzibar, because Ali, Isa Hassan, and a lot of the martial artists who live in Bagamoyo actually come from Zanzibar. So they're raised in Zanzibar, specifically the island of 𝗵𝗶, which is, there are two islands of Zanzibar. There's 𝗵𝗶, which is a smaller island, and there's Unguja, which is the larger island. And 𝗵𝗶 is sort of the poorer island. And if you want to get a sense of the relationship between Zanzibar and 𝗵𝗶, if you take a boat from Zanzibar to 𝗵𝗶, the boat's full of clothes, TVs, radios. The boat back is bananas and agricultural goods. So it's literally kind of a colonial, and that's just within the archipelago of Zanzibar. So a lot of 𝗵𝗶s will leave home and then go to Unguja, and then from Unguja they would go to Tanzania, to mainland Tanzania, where they worked as business people. And 𝗵𝗶s themselves say that they're very tough. So they have this. So when I would ask sometimes, like, why are so many 𝗵𝗶s involved in martial arts, they would say, well, we're not like these mainlander Zanzibaris who they sit around drinking coffee, which is sort of associated with the Arab sort of influence. But then again, also a lot of 𝗵𝗶s themselves have Arab influence, including Isa Hassan as well. But so it's very complicated. But I went to Zanzibar for a very brief trip in 2016 to basically just talk with Ali's teachers and his former classmates. And what we learned very quickly was, okay, it wasn't Chinese. It was actually North Koreans. So North Korean military instructors had, in the 1980s, North Korea also had a lot of exchanges with African countries, including military training. And so Tanzania during the Cold War had relations with everybody. They were never fully on one side or the other. I mean, Nyerere believed in socialism. He tried to build socialism in Tanzania through a form of African socialism called Ujamaa. But he was also very resistant to being part of any bloc. He liked China because he felt China wasn't as willing to interfere domestically as he felt like, say, the Soviets or the Americans were. But he was never aligned with one or the other. And so Tanzania was very popular with both so-called Western donors as well as everyone else. And so they had relationships with everyone. I mean, so their military was trained by Americans, they were trained by Chinese, they were trained by Israelis, and so they were kind of all over the map. And so North Koreans as well. So in the early 1980s, the reason specifically was that Tanzania had a war with Uganda. So Idi Amin of Uganda had invaded part of Tanzania, And so they went in and invaded back Uganda and actually kicked Amin out. And Museveni, who's now still the president of Uganda, was actually trained in, he spent his years of political exile in Tanzania, and a lot of his political training was in Tanzania. So that was sort of the context in which why they would invite North Korean military instructors to come and teach. And so in Zanzibar, they would teach paratrooping, they would teach various other types of military skills, but also hand-to-hand combat. And this, from what we learned, was where their students then left the military, then opened up their own schools. And some of those commandos in the Zanzibar military, about 10 of them were selected to go to North Korea for training for about a year. And there was one master in Zanzibar who showed us his certificate. Had a picture of him with what they call the big frilly hat, the big wool hat, black and white photo.
Yeah.
Very cold in Korea. His certificate all written in Korean. And so this was an interesting kind of discovery that there was this whole other route of martial arts in Tanzania. But then again, the question still was there. Why were the North Koreans teaching karate?
Yeah, so be more precise, they should teach, I don't know, it's just stereotype, but the taekwondo, right?
Not taekwondo.
Or
They
some
have their own
kind of
version called
combat
jiu-jitsu.
technique. Because I remember reading this recent biography by, I believe, Monica Garcia called A Black Girl in Pyongyang. She was the daughter of the of Equatorial Guinea's dictator, and was sent along with her siblings and some of the other children of African head of states to study in Pyongyang and stayed for many years. And I believe all of them went to an elite school training North Korean leaders' children, and the boys would usually train in combat techniques. So I think there is somewhat that connection. I read about it, I suppose, on the other side of how they, of their experiences when they're already in North Korea. But it kind of, ties in together. I think Derek is telling me the other side of the story. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I'm still trying to figure out exactly what was being taught. One of the interesting things about this research is I'm kind of approaching this research. I don't know what I would say, like deliberate ignorance, or willful ignorance. What I mean by that is, as I said before, I don't have a background as a martial artist. There are people who are involved in this field now, so-called martial arts studies, and a lot of them are basically practitioners who are also academics, and so they have a sort of understanding of things. And I feel if I had training in martial arts, I could probably kind of get things much quicker. But the fact I'm just relying on what people are telling me, I'm kind of approaching this from I don't want to say the word veil of ignorance because it has this sort of philosophical meaning, but I would say veil of ignorance. And so I'm just sort of following what people are telling me about what these particular things are. And so I do know that in North Korea there was a martial art called 𝗓𝗠 I don't know if the pronunciation is correct, which was sort of their own version, similar to Taekwondo, but it was North Korean military martial arts. And that this was a style that they would teach when they did military diplomacy in the socialist world in the Cold War. So apparently the former head of the East German intelligence was like a black belt in that. And so, I asked people in Tanzania who trained in what they call combat, was it 𝗓𝗠? They had never heard of this. I even showed a video of 𝗓𝗠, and they said, no, that's not it. And so it wasn't that, it was something else. So this question kind of keeps going on, and it's fascinating because I'm afraid if I go on more, there'll be no ending to the conversation, because the more I do research on this, the more confused the story becomes, because it's sort of there's two levels. One level is this sort of issue of what country does it come from, right? I guess this is like the very sort of entry level question, because I came to this topic with the sort of this Africa-China framework in my mind as a researcher, and then it became North Korea. I'm kind of working in that kind of framework. And of course, if you look at the history of martial arts, there's a lot of contention about where do martial arts come from, which is very closely connected to nationalist politics, especially in East Asia. And so in the case of Korean martial arts, to what degree post-colonial Korean martial arts were influenced by Japanese colonial martial arts is hugely controversial, right? That's not something that I think Korean martial artists would emphasize, like the influences of karate. You got to take out that karate influence and say this is purely based on the Korean traditions which we already had. Same thing in Japan. So to call karate Japanese is itself controversial. I say that because I was giving a talk on this very topic in Shanghai, and where I kind of referred to it as Japanese karate. And someone in the audience, I don't know where they were from, but they were like, no. It's not Japanese karate. It's Okinawan karate. So it's an Okinawan kind of nationalist perspective, which is that this was something that the Japanese appropriated from the Okinawans and made into their national sport, in the 1930s. And of course, Okinawa itself. I mean, one of the reasons why karate became so popular after the war was so many American GIs who were stationed in Okinawa during the occupation were training with Okinawan martial artists, and so the American imperial presence is also an important part of the story as well. But then again, you could say, well, where do the Okinawan martial arts come from? Oh, from southern China. But these are like these kinds of games are very, very common in martial arts history. I was reading something about apparently there's like a lot of like Australian martial artists or American martial artists who will then claim that, oh, karate now in Australia is better than Japan. So I think you have this sort of weird politics which happens, but then you realize it's not just about the nationalism, it's also about politics of charisma. So everyone wants to defend their teachers. And as I did more research in Tanzania, I discovered it was the same there. That what I was thinking was an issue about nationalism and about Africa and Asia. Because as a foreign anthropologist in Africa, I think there's this sort of predisposition that we want to find African agency. I mean, this isn't a really important issue. I'm speaking to this as a white anthropologist. From my experiences, I think the way I see it among non-African scholars who sort of talk about African agency, I think there's a bit of it's a bit marked as too much. I feel like there's such an emphasis on it that we don't say the same about, well, where's Asian agency or where's European agency? That being said, I think it's important that African martial artists are inventing stuff. And that's another part of the story as well, is that the more I did research, I discovered a lot of African martial artists were inventing their own styles. There was a style invented by someone named 𝗬𝘁𝘗𝗵𝗹, who sadly just passed away last week, who invented a style called Barazai, which only 10 people know in Zanzibar. But I saw it's very different from other things. There are other martial artists they did Shotokan when they were younger, and now an older teacher, he does this form of stick fighting. What he says is he basically, based on everything he learned from both Shotokan but also from yoga, because he spent time in India learning yoga, he says he sort of broke it down to what the fundamentals of martial arts are, and this is actually an African tradition. So he invented his own style, which he teaches like 5 students. And so you find that there's actually a lot of interesting sort of these stories to be told. And so what I'm saying about African agency, I'm not denying it, but I'm just talking about its urban-determined element in knowledge production. But the reason I bring it up was because I was so focused on finding African creativity and sort of how Africans are authoring martial arts. It's not just Asian influences that we're seeing traces of locally. That for the people themselves, that's not really the issue. A lot of it's which teacher has authority, right? And so I won't get into sort of the details of the teachers, but in my most recent research trip, a lot of the controversy was combat invented by this Tanzanian martial artist, or because he was so creative. So some said, oh, what he did is he combined karate with other styles, and then he created this. And then others said, no, he never did that. He never went to Korea. This teacher went to Korea, so he actually has more authority to teach. And so Asia is important here because it's helping these teachers claim authenticity, right? And it's really about the personalities of teachers more than about Africa, Asia. And so that's something I've sort of realized as I do is that these politics are sort of more politics with a small p, not these sort of larger. Not that they're not important, because these politics are still there. Like when you take it out of one frame, you find another frame. And so when me and Eunice presented together once in China, a Cameroonian scholar was telling us that what you're describing because one of the things we were talking about as well is Ali-Isa Hassan, he's also a traditional healer. So he communicates with jinn, with spirits. It's a whole other part of the story. And so when we were talking about this, our Cameroonian colleague said, well, what you're describing, we have the same thing in Cameroon. We also have martial artists there who are doing karate, and they also communicate with spirits, right? They get energy from spirits. There's something common here. And you're saying, this is something that's African. Because what we were saying that this is about Islam, because that's what the people we're talking to are telling us, right? This is what Hassan says, this is about Islam, right? But this guy from Cameroon was saying, no, it's not about Islam. And you Africans on the coastline are a bit kind of strange because you're kind of mixed, but the real Africa is in West Africa, right? And so these politics will always come up, and so it's kind of hard to navigate it. But it's also very interesting to me because what's interesting to me is the way these narratives kind of get created, kind of this process of creating narratives. And one of the things that's made this project fun in many ways is that the fact I'm involved in doing this research project in collaboration with Ali-Isa Hassan and with other people in that dojo, they're learning things along with me as well. So a lot of these particular stories, Hassan himself didn't know as either, like where his teacher had learned it from. And as we both learn, both our stories are sort of changing. So even though I'm involved with this project of trying to write a history, not like a comprehensive history, but trying to see what this method can kind of reveal about the local histories of martial arts. Ali-Isa Hassan, he's working on a series of books which is based on his training with spirits who are teaching him a whole other history. And he's in the process of trying to publish this. It's not just about martial arts, it's also about the origins of football. So he's actually in the process of writing a book about the history of football in Africa, which is very different from the received history. It involves relationships with jinn. And so he has a huge corpus of knowledge that he's in the process of developing. And it's become kind of a collaboration that both me and Eunice are trying to help him publish because he wants to disseminate his views. And of course, he's also helping us with our research as well. He helps me because I'm doing this research project on Africa, Asia. He helps Eunice because Eunice has another aspect of this group, which I forgot to mention, is this dojo, they also are filmmakers. And so the reason they founded their dojo was to make action movies. And that was actually the original goal. And one of the reasons I got involved as well was they didn't just invite me to help pay for the cement. They also wanted me to star in one of their movies. And they wanted Chinese actors to be in their film. And that was sort of how that connection began as well. And Eunice, my colleague, he has actually made movies based on his own ethnography, his own fieldwork, which is about health workers, community health workers in Tanzania. He learned stories about the lives of community health workers. And he says, oh, this would be a really good drama. And so he basically gave the story idea to 𝗬𝗓𝗓 Letunu. He was one of these community health workers. He now lives in Bagamoyo. He also works with me as a research assistant. And 𝗬𝗓𝗓 and the people from this dojo worked together to create a movie, which was like a dramatization of the struggles that community health workers have. There's a little bit of martial arts in it, but it's not the main part of the story. But you sort of see there's so many different things that comes out of this collaboration. And I think the most rewarding part of this research has been the fact it really does feel like a collaboration. Like everyone's sort of doing their own kind of project in relation to this. But it's been difficult because, COVID, Taiwan's very from Tanzania, so it's kind of hard to go back and forth. But this is sort of an ongoing project that I'm working on.
Okay, so
thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing, Derek. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Today we have learned a lot. I realized how complicated and how many things relate not only to Tanzania, but also, we went to North Korea and also different countries. I'm very happy to have you today, and I wish we could maybe go deeper with you later on in another occasions. And for our audience who have interest in your research, we will also list your website and also your papers below in the descriptions of this episode.
Thank you so much. So we'll wrap it up
Thank
here
you.
and hope to see you next time. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.